Montezuma Castle National Monument, Arizona. Visitors marvel at the majesty of ancient homes built under the overhang of a sheer canyon wall. They try to imagine what life was like here hundreds of years ago, when these cliffs echoed a different language, the language of the people who built this place, lived here for a while, then moved away, never to return. At sites throughout the Southwest, many of them protected in national parks and monuments, early Americans have left thousands of reminders of their existence, clues to an understanding of their lives and cultures. This is the story of those ancient people and how we know what we think we know about them. A journey deep into prehistory. Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado rises 2,000 feet above the surrounding plains. In the 1880s, the Wetherells, a family of cattle ranchers, lived near Mesa Verde. They heard from local Indians that there were old stone buildings in the cliffs of the mesa.
They became very interested in the area here in Mesa Verde, especially the oldest one, Richard. They would graze cattle in the Mancos Canyon, and some of those cattle then would come up these side canyons. So these cowboys had to look for the cattle.
One day in December of 1888, while searching for a stray animal, Richard Wetherell caught sight of something truly amazing. A beautiful ancient city set in an alcove of sandstone. He called it the Cliff Palace. Within days, he and his brothers found more equally exquisite buildings in the mesa walls. Though other white men, trappers or prospectors, had probably seen these places too, the Wetherells were the first to spread the word about them.
They publicized information. They were interested. They had enough knowledge and background themselves that they wanted to get information out to other areas, and they even contacted the Smithsonian with information.
The discoveries at Mesa Verde were soon world famous. But evidence of sophisticated ancient cultures in the Southwest, like these massive masonry ruins in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon, had long before aroused scientific interest. Many sites were treasure troves filled with carefully crafted tools of daily life in prehistoric times. At the Western Archaeological and Conservation Center in Tucson, a scientist examines beads and shells uncovered during a recent excavation at Arizona's Tonto National Monument. These shells come from ocean beaches hundreds of miles from where they were found. They are keys to the past, suggesting that the ancient inhabitants of Tonto were travelers or traders.
We have in this building more than 2 million artifacts from archaeological sites in national parks in the West. And on the tables in front of us, we have a selection of those artifacts gleaned from more than 100 years of archaeological excavation and surface survey. What an archaeologist does when they come in and finds these artifacts is what they're looking at is trying to reconstruct the life ways of the prehistoric people who used the artifacts. What were they eating? What were they wearing? What kind of plant materials did they use to make their netting or their baskets, for instance? All those things artifacts can tell you.
Archaeology is detective work, unlocking secrets from prehistoric times, before people kept written records of their activities and thoughts. In the Southwest, such work began more than a century ago, with a few questions. Who were the architects of these ancient structures? Where did they come from? Where did they go? The homesteaders who settled Arizona's Verde Valley in the second half of the 19th century thought they knew. They'd heard of the great Aztec civilization and its emperor, Montezuma, and that the Aztecs had migrated south into the Valley of Mexico not long before they were conquered by Cortez. So they named this cliff dwelling Montezuma Castle, thinking the Aztecs had built it. Other settlers who moved to the area around Farmington, New Mexico, called this place Aztec Ruins. They also imagined that Aztecs had once lived here. Some 19th century observers suggested that the people who designed these grand buildings had not migrated but simply disappeared. Such ideas brought an aura of romance and mystery to the region. They also had broad economic implications.
When New Mexico became part of the United States, the Pueblo people were living on some of the best farmlands along the Rio Grande, and there were many people, one of those Pueblo people removed from that land so we could use it.
It was hard, though, to win public support for evicting people who were heirs to magnificent ancient wonders like those of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. So it was argued that Pueblo Indians had merely copied their masonry architecture from ruins left by vanished civilizations.
What the early archaeologists did, along with working with the Pueblo people who knew their own past, of course, was establish scientifically that Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde were ancestral sites to modern Pueblo people, and that Pueblo people had been on that land living in monumental architectural structures when Europe was still in the Dark Ages.
One of the first people to make the connection was a Swiss-born anthropologist named Adolf Bandelier, who arrived in Santa Fe in 1880 with a small grant to study the indigenous peoples of the Southwest.
And he ended up living at Cochiti, Pueblo, and talking with the people there, finding out everything that he could about their lives and their history and their way of life and their culture.
Late in October of 1880, a Cochiti Indian, Juan Jose Montoya, led Bandelier to a cliff top overlooking a beautiful valley. In his diary, Bandelier described the view.
The grandest thing I ever saw. The cliffs are vertical on the north side, and their bases are used as dwellings, both from the inside and by inserting the roof poles for stories outside. It is of the highest interest.
The dwellings Bandelier saw had long been abandoned, but he believed they had been built by the ancestors of his Indian friends, as they had told him. In the years that followed, Bandelier traveled widely throughout the Southwest, seeking other evidence of prehistoric civilizations.
He was a driven person. This was his life. And there was this whole unknown area out here to be explored and to be documented, and only one of Bandelier to do it. If it meant writing all night long, if it meant doing his work when his hands were arthritic and he had writer's cramp, he would do it. He was desperate. I mean, he was dirt poor. It wasn't that he wanted to walk 50 miles in a day, which he often did. He very often didn't have enough money to rent a horse.
Yet in all his travels, Bandelier never forgot this valley, now part of a national monument named for him.
When he got around to writing a novel in 1890, which was published in 1890 actually, he set it here in this canyon and put in the novel everything that he had learned about the lives of these people. He took away everything he thought was Spanish influence and showed the way the people would have lived, how they would have related to each other. The book is called The Delight Makers, and it's such a classic that it's still in print now, although it was first printed in 1890.
Where today only vacant holes stare at the visitor, human eyes peered through. Sometimes a man, a woman, or a child would creep out of one of these openings, and climbing upward would disappear in the entrance of an upper tier of cave dwellings. Others would descend the slope from the cliffs to the fields, while still others returned from the banks of the ditch or the brook.
From Indian dances he'd actually seen, Bandelier conjured up an ancient ceremony.
The several roofs of the large house, rising in successive terraces 3 stories high, form an irregular amphitheater, filled with humanity of all sizes, shapes, ages, clothing, in glaring contrast to one another. The fantastic headdresses of the women nod and vibrate like waving plants of Indian corn. Thumping and drumming rise into the deep blue sky, re-echoing from the towering cliffs.
It was a novel. It was the only novel he ever wrote. Like everything else in his life, he didn't make any money off of it. He was very concerned that people in America, especially and overseas as well, pictured the Indians either as just noble savages or barbarians, and he didn't feel like that was fair. He wanted them to see the Indian people as humans like everyone else. And so in the book you have good guys and bad guys, and people that are honorable and people that are not honorable, and just the whole gamut of people and how they act.
Other explorers followed Bandelier. They began to excavate dozens of ruins dotting the southwestern landscape. Many were interested only in artifacts, but some, like Frank Cushing, who lived for years among the Zuni, shared Bandelier's beliefs that the stories and customs of contemporary Indian people offered valuable clues toward understanding their ancestors. For these early scientists, one of the most pressing questions concerned the age of ruins and artifacts. How old were they? And how could one find out?
Archaeological methods really evolved in the early decades of the 20th century. I think we weren't really doing much with stratigraphy until A.V. Kidder started his work at Pecos National Monument.
Stratigraphy was a concept first developed by geologists. If a site was undisturbed, they suggested, then the deeper the strata in which something was found, the older it was.
When Kidder was excavating at Pecos, he took great care to look at the stratigraphy in the Pueblos and the other areas that he was dating, so that he could get a relative sequence for the artifacts that he found there. And he was really the one to put that concept that geologists use, called superposition, into effect in the Southwest. And now it's adopted and it's used everywhere by archaeologists.
As they dug deeply into trash mounds at sites where long-term human occupation was evident, archaeologists found that styles of pottery had evolved over time. When they found recognizable pottery styles while excavating new sites, they could tell whether one site was younger or older than another, but just how old were they exactly? The keys to the answer, it might be said, grew on trees. At the University of Arizona, Professor Jeff Dean examines a section of a beam from an ancient ruin to determine its age. Early in the 20th century, an astronomer from Flagstaff, Arizona, named A.E. Douglas reasoned that the pattern of annual growth rings in trees corresponded to periods of drought or wet weather in a particular region.
In 1914, this work came to the attention of archaeologists who immediately saw the potential for dating wood from prehistoric structures in the Southwest.
Working with them, Douglas developed two long-term chronologies of tree ring patterns, one extending from the present back to about the year 1300. The other, drawn from roof beams in ancient Southwest ruins, was also about 600 years long. But there was a gap of undetermined length between the two periods. Then came a stunning breakthrough. On June 22, 1929, at the Whipple Ruin in Show Low, Arizona, archaeologists found a burned roof beam whose inner rings matched the ancient pattern and whose outer rings matched the modern one. Douglas did some calculating. This means that Chaco Canyon was occupied in the 11th and early 12th centuries, he told a hushed group of archaeologists that night. The age riddle had been solved.
And these are the actual pieces of charcoal that come from that particular log that bridged the gap and produced absolute calendar dates for prehistoric sites in the Southwest. And that was the first time that archaeologists in the Southwest or anywhere else had actual calendar dates for prehistoric sites. Since that time, the chronology for the Southwest has been extended backwards to 322 BC, and we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 tree ring dates for around 5,000 sites.
The dates are remarkably precise.
The ring sequence in this particular piece of wood, when compared to the master dated chronology, allows us to determine that the central ring on this section was grown by the tree in AD 521. The tree then produced a little more than 100 additional rings until it was cut down by someone for use in the pit house in AD 623. This date of the tree's death allows us to apply that year to that particular structure. So we know that that pit house in Broken Flute Cave was built in 623.
A new technique called radiocarbon dating developed in 1950, and an even newer technology, the accelerator mass spectrometer, allow scientists to date other once-living materials as small as a few grains of pollen. Though not nearly as precise as tree rings, radiocarbon methods can date materials as old as 50,000 years. In the Southwest, archaeologists have found spear points alongside the bones of long-extinct mammoths and giant bison. Radiocarbon dating of such bones provides answers about the earliest human occupation of the area.
The general pattern of settlement in the Southwest seems to have been that we had early big game hunters, we call them Paleo-Indians, who came in about 9,500 BC. This was followed several thousand years later by about 6,000 BC or so by a group we call Archaic, and these folks were not only hunters, but they were gatherers. They hunted the small game because by that time the larger game, such as the mammoths, were extinct at the end of the Ice Age.
By about 2000 BC, a slow but important change was beginning in the American Southwest: the domestication of corn and other crops. This agricultural revolution spread to the area from Mexico, where it had taken root several millennia earlier. Among the oral traditions of the Hopi, who have lived for centuries on the high mesas of northern Arizona, there is a legend about agriculture's origins.
Long, long ago, before people knew how to plant crops, a little man carrying a large sack of corn went from place to place. Sometimes, when he cast a shadow on rock walls, the sack he was carrying made him look deformed, like a hunchback. He showed people how to dig a hole in the ground and plant the grains of corn. The ancient ones left his image everywhere on the rocks. They called him Kokopelli.
In time, the ancestral farmers of the Southwest domesticated many other crops. They developed new and hardier varieties that could thrive in the harsh desert and mountain environments of the region.
And because they had a crop that they could count on, more or less, they were able to build a surplus of seeds and carry over seed stores for the following year's crops. And this allowed them to become a lot more settled than they had been prior, when they were more dependent on the wild plants and the wild animals for their economy.
The American Southwest is a region of rugged and extremely varied topography and climate. Precipitous mountains and stark deserts, freezing cold and searing heat, a place where water is always a precious resource. Archaeologists categorize the prominent ancient cultures of the region according to their unique and creative adaptations to the sharp differences in southwestern environments. The Hohokam flourished in the hot and arid Sonoran Desert in what is now southern Arizona and northwest Mexico. The Anasazi, or ancestral Pueblo people, farmed the high, wide plateau of the Four Corners region. The Mogollon lived in the even higher mountainous areas between the desert and the plateau. Scattered among them were smaller, less well-defined groups, such as the Sinawa and Salado people. From its origins in the springs and snowfields of the Mogollon Mountains, Arizona's Salt River winds tempestuously through deep canyons. Eventually, this water will find its way to the broad plain of the Sonoran Desert, passing through today's metropolis of Phoenix. In and around Phoenix, the Salt River has been diverted into a system of canals. Many of these modern canals follow precisely the patterns of earlier irrigation systems, hand-dug by the Hohokam, indigenous people who once flourished in the Salt and Gila River valleys.
This house here is a reconstruction of what a Hohokam house may have looked like around 1,000 years ago. The Hohokam had almost a perfect adaptation to the desert environment in which they lived, and they built a house to make it so they were more comfortable living in such a desert environment.
Hohokam pit houses like this one were warm in winter but cool in summer, when the temperature sometimes reached 120 degrees.
When the Hohokam were first studied, the archaeologists working here at the Gila River Indian Community at the site of Snaketown thought that the constellations of traits that define the Hohokam, such as red and buff pottery, shell working, cremation burial, the evidence of irrigation agriculture, may have originated from Mexico, where migrant groups of people moved up into this area and settled in the river valleys. Today, archaeologists believe that the Hohokam, while influenced by populations from Mexico, really developed out of an earlier archaic population.
At Park of the Canals in Mesa, Arizona, part of the old Hohokam Canal system, the longest and deepest ever built by prehistoric people in North America, is still visible.
The Sonoran Desert here has two rainy seasons. It has a winter rainy season, and it also has a summer rainy season. The irrigated crops also had two seasons. In the spring, when the rivers were high, then later in the summer, with the monsoon storms, the rivers would also rise again, and again the canals would fill with irrigation water, and the crops, corn, squash, and beans, could be planted.
They also gathered wild foods from the desert. For example, the pods of the common mesquite tree could be ground into high-protein flour.
As we look out across the desert and see a kind of a barren landscape, the plants are full of stickers and thorns. It doesn't seem like it would be a cornucopia of edible plants, but in fact it is. There's more than 300 species of edible plants.
And wild plants were valuable in other ways.
This is the devil's claw plant, and it is a food plant. You can eat these pods when they're smaller, much like okra, and the seeds are edible, but it was domesticated by Native Americans for a different use. They use these claws from the devil's claws as fibers to make beautiful baskets. And this is the creosote bush. This is the pharmacy of the desert. It's reputed to cure almost anything that ails you.
Excavation of Hohokam sites began comparatively recently, much of it in the 1930s, because such sites were not as evident to the naked eye as the Pueblo ruins farther north.
You look at even the largest Hohokam sites, and for the most part it looks to the viewer like just that much desert, lumpy desert, because they're mounds of dirt. But that's about it. For the most part, they lived in pit houses till fairly late. They did not cluster in tight little villages like the Pueblos did. And to this day, their descendants prefer to live spread out, not right on top of one another.
Archaeologists divide Hohokam history into 4 distinct periods. The earliest, the Pioneer, lasted from about 300 to 700 AD, when the great irrigation systems were first constructed.
We believe that the Hohokam were trading with the west coast of Mexico quite early in their history, probably before we can identify them as Hohokam, and that they continued an extensive trade in shell, in turquoise, in metalwork. We see copper bells showing up in Hohokam sites, sometimes in considerable quantities, and these we know were made far south on the west coast of Mexico.
During the colonial period from about 700 to 900 AD and the sedentary period from 900 to 1100, trading networks were expanded, and the Hohokam began to borrow freely from the great Mexican civilizations to the south. They built ball courts, similar to those used by the Maya, where competitive games were probably played. The colonial and sedentary periods were characterized by the expansion of Hohokam culture over a wide region and by a flourishing of the arts, particularly pottery and finely crafted shell work. Every few minutes, a modern jetliner soars over the partially excavated walls of Pueblo Grande, an ancient Hohokam settlement now entirely surrounded by metropolitan Phoenix.
The Hohokam seem to be, for most of their history, remarkably good at producing sufficient stability in the food supply to maintain villages for many, many centuries, and it's one of the most distinctive things about them.
During the Classic period, which began about 1100 AD, the Hohokam built many large structures called platform mounds from which an elite may have presided over the rest of society.
We believe they developed increasingly a system in which for the first time some people had considerably more access perhaps to power than other people did. And this would have been fairly new in the Hohokam world. They were a very stable society for the most part, and they seem to have been a very egalitarian society.
These massive ruins, now protected by Casa Grande National Monument, have long attracted attention. They stand stark and alone on the desert halfway between Phoenix and Tucson. Casa Grande, the big house, was built during the Classic period. It was completely abandoned by the year 1450, a date that marks the end of Hohokam culture. Only in the Classic period did the Hohokam build great houses like Casa Grande. Did people live here? Who? We don't know for sure. Some archaeologists believe Casa Grande was an astronomical observatory. Others think it was one of the palaces of the last lords of the Hohokam. Now in his 80s, Julian Hayden is a legendary figure in southwestern archaeology. Julian has always been an amateur archaeologist. His experience dates to the 1930s when he worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps on excavations at Casa Grande, Pueblo Grande, and the Hohokam site called Snaketown. Among the laborers at Snaketown were members of the Pima tribe, who many archaeologists believe are direct descendants of the Hohokam. Hayden found Juan Smith, a Pima storyteller, who agreed to tell him the oral history of the tribe.
So that's what we did. Every possible night I drove from Chandler after I closed camp and sat up until we got tired and took it all down. I didn't edit it or anything else. I just wrote it down. And later on I typed it and lay in the files all these years until now.
Now the story has been published as a book. Hayden believes that together with archaeological evidence, it explains what happened in the final years of the Hohokam.
First they had a 20-year drought. Then they had a flood. So large it flooded the entire valley and must have destroyed all the head gates and all the canals, as well as many of the big buildings. And as a matter of fact, when I excavated the northwest corner of that big building at Pueblo Grande, I found flood-deposited silts and gravels in the rooms.
While Hohokam rulers living in the big houses hoarded food, their subjects starved. Finally, the peasants rose up against the lords and high priests.
And they formed an army and attacked all of the big houses, killed or drove out the leaders. And this all happened because of the great floods and the droughts.
Afterwards, Hayden says the common people returned to an earlier, simpler way of life in the desert. Is he right? These walls might tell us if they could speak, but for now, at least, the truth remains a mystery. During the Classic period of the Hohokam, another ancient culture was leaving its mark hundreds of miles to the north. Cliff dwellings like this one and countless other prehistoric settlements on the vast Colorado Plateau were built by an ancient culture that archaeologists for many years called Anasazi. It's a Navajo word meaning ancient foreigners or ancient enemies. The Navajos now dominate the Colorado Plateau area, but they were relative newcomers to the region, hunter-gatherers from northern Canada, who came here in the 14th century, when most of the great masonry towns of the area had already been abandoned. Contemporary Pueblo Indians reject the use of the Navajo word Anasazi to describe their forebears. They prefer terms like ancestral Pueblo. As with the Hohokam, archaeologists divide ancestral Pueblo history into several distinct periods. The basket maker periods extended from the earliest origins of agriculture in the area until about 700 AD. By the time the basket maker III period began, about the year 400, a settled farming life was evident. Finely woven baskets dating from this period have been found in dry caves throughout the Colorado Plateau. The typical basket maker dwelling was a pit house dug into the earth and covered with brush, poles, and mud. Small above-ground structures made of stone first appeared in the area during the Pueblo I era, beginning about 700 AD. Throughout the prehistoric Pueblo periods, which lasted until the Spanish entered the Southwest in 1540, the vast majority of people lived in scattered extended family dwellings we call unit pueblos, usually consisting of fewer than a dozen masonry rooms. Often these dwellings included subterranean chambers, which contemporary Puebloans called kivas. Originally used as winter dwellings, the kivas eventually became centers for ceremonies and religious rites. By the beginning of the Pueblo II period, about 900 AD, many unit pueblos had come together to form small villages. Population was growing. Fine pottery, including corrugated cooking wares, was being produced in large quantities.
On the average, the pueblos were being occupied for something like 25 to 30 years, and then they would move on as the resources around were being used. Everything from animal life to forest products. And then when the ground became infertile, they also moved in.
There's thousands of old villages that dot the landscape. We're not all occupied at the same time. They're a result of people moving from place to place to place to place.
Then in the 10th century, in a dry New Mexico valley now called Chaco Canyon, something truly remarkable happened.
Now, Chaco is a transforming event in Pueblo prehistory. There was nothing like Chaco before Chaco. There's nothing like Chaco after Chaco. That kind of massing that we think of as pueblos, with rooms adjacent to each other and terraced around a plaza, that began at Chaco.
This is Pueblo Bonito. It covers an area equal to 3 football fields and contains more than 600 rooms. It was the largest apartment building ever constructed in the United States until 1882, when a bigger one was built in New York City. Pueblo Bonito is the most famous of more than a dozen massive structures in Chaco Canyon. We call them great houses. Built beneath a south-facing cliff, Pueblo Bonito was a kind of giant solar collector. The cliff and the walls of the building itself stored the sun's heat by day, reflecting it out at night, so that while outside temperatures might vary as much as 50 degrees from day to night, in these rooms the change would be less than 5 degrees. From above, the D shape of Pueblo Bonito is readily apparent, its rooms built around a broad plaza. We also see many kivas, some of them 30 feet wide or more. The masonry of Pueblo Bonito and other Chaco great houses is among the finest ever designed. Millions of carefully cut stones were needed to make these walls, which once stood 5 stories high in places.
The stone is local, although they were quarrying it from up on top of the mesa and maybe a mile or 2 distant from this building, because as the building grew, the source of the stone was farther and farther away. But it's local. The timbers started out in the early construction being local species like cottonwood and pinon and juniper. But as the building grew and the size of the rooms grew, they went farther and farther out for timbers that fit the size of the buildings.
More than 200,000 trees were cut down to provide beams for the great houses of Chaco Canyon. Some of them came from as far away as the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, a distance of 100 miles. Since Chacoans did not use wheels, lines of men would have had to carry 1,000-pound logs over those vast distances.
Many hands would make light work, but the many hands would have to be well organized. So there's some authority, some positions which could coordinate that labor and get everything in one spot at one point in time, all the people there, enough to feed those people to get those buildings built. There were skilled artisans, there were people, master masons, there were people, architects, people in charge that were directing all this building. But I would imagine that the labor was contributed from a very large population which called Chaco its center.
Our evidence from the water control studies that we did in the Chaco quite a number of years ago suggest that in fact the entire north side of the canyon for the lower 12 to 15 miles was probably one continuous gridded garden.
The Chacoans were also accomplished engineers. Today, part of Pueblo Bonito lies under rubble, formed when a section of the cliff called Threatening Rock collapsed in 1941.
The Indians, the prehistoric Chacoans, had done an enormously good job. They were obviously aware that there was erosion at the base and this was bringing it down. They had jammed an enormous amount of logs into it. Countless numbers of prayer sticks had been placed at the base and stuck into the wood and the rocks at the base of Threatening Rock. So they were not only counting on their engineering skills to keep it from falling down, they were counting on the gods to keep it from falling down, and it worked.
In 1941, after U.S. Army engineers replaced the ancient stabilizers with modern ones, Threatening Rock toppled, destroying 65 of Pueblo Bonito's rooms. Gwyn Vivian's father, Gordon, began working as an archaeologist in Chaco Canyon during the 1930s. Gwyn himself spent years digging at Chaco and is often credited with discovering the Chacoan roads.
I rediscovered them, let me put it that way. The Wetherells, who were there in the 1890s, saw them. They reported them. They photographed them.
Today, aerial photographs and field work have identified hundreds of miles of prehistoric roads, extending from the canyon to other Chacoan-style great houses, like the one now called Aztec Ruins.
There are basically 7 major roads. These roads are 30 feet wide. They're clearly engineered. What I think we're looking at here is the use of roads to link segments of great house populations that were placed out as colonies on the edge of the San Juan Basin.
Communications among the many towns of the Chacoan network probably involved runners, a tradition carried on by these contemporary Pueblo boys.
And before the horse came, the Pueblo people were running long distances. It was the easiest form of transportation. My guess is that when the Spanish came in 1540 into what is now Zuni, the Pueblos in the north here probably knew about it the next day or so.
Excavations at Chaco Canyon have uncovered thousands of examples of fine pottery and other evidence of a flourishing and complex society. Archaeologist Steve Lexon, who spent 10 years at Chaco, examines some of the hundreds of thousands of artifacts that have been found in the canyon.
Their connections were far beyond the limits of the Southwest as we understand it today. A great deal of the pottery that you find at Chaco is not made at Chaco. Many of the utilitarian sorts of things, the stone that was used for making arrowheads and drills, was not from Chaco. Well, from within the Pueblo world, you have turquoise that would be coming from Santa Fe area today, which is quite some distance from Chaco. From further away, you would get copper bells, which were made in western Mexico and traded up. Shell from the Pacific coast, from the Gulf of California and from the shores of California itself, came into Chaco more often than not as finished objects, bracelets and beads and things that made magnificent jewelry.
Recent evidence also suggests that Fajada Butte and other sites in Chaco Canyon were astronomical observation posts, where Chacoans followed carefully the movement of the sun and stars. Archaeologists believe that this pictograph in Chaco Canyon depicts a major astronomical event, a supernova that occurred in the year 1054. Over the years, archaeologists have learned much about what they commonly call the Chaco phenomenon. But many questions remain unanswered and controversy persists, especially over the role of the great houses themselves. Many experts now believe that only a small number of priests and other leaders actually lived in buildings like Pueblo Bonito. They think the great houses probably functioned as storage or ceremonial centers for activities involving the entire region.
Some feel that this may be a ritual or ceremonial center, that the focus or the purpose for this was to hold ceremony, and people would come in on a seasonal or a periodic basis to watch or participate in those kinds of ceremonies.
Evidence for such public activities includes the plazas within the great houses and the great kivas associated with Chacoan sites. Casa Rinconada, a great kiva not far from Pueblo Bonito, is more than 60 feet in diameter. At Aztec Ruins National Monument, a Chacoan site, the Great Kiva has been reconstructed so that it looks much the way the great kivas must have appeared in the 11th and 12th centuries. For contemporary Pueblo Indians, kivas like these are evidence of their link to the past.
Everything in Pueblo life is a spiritual way of being. The wind that blows, the clouds that are passing, and so, you know, all of it is a cycle of life that is. And the great Pueblo minds develop those kinds of thinking in the kivas.
What finally happened to the complex, highly organized civilization that originated in this barren valley? The mystery persists.
In the middle 1100s, people left Chaco Canyon, and archaeologists have not really been able to define where they went or who they became in terms of modern Puebloan people.
The Great Tower 5, if you'll each grab a bucket and follow me, please.
High on a windswept plain near Cortez, Colorado, amateur archaeologists participate in a course offered by the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Led by professionals, they excavate portions of an ancient village, a site now called Yellow Jacket Pueblo.
The site has seen amateur excavation for the past 100 years, and what that means is that when we come out, there are areas that have been very heavily excavated already, and so what we are trying to do is not only unravel what the site was left like at the end of the prehistoric occupation, but also we have to compensate and work around the kind of disturbance that's happened in the years since then. The sagebrush actually is covering a number of room blocks, probably up to about 25 masonry room blocks, somewhere around 175 kivas, and probably 23 towers. The structure behind me is a great tower, which was probably 3 stories tall. So there is a lot of architecture here, probably including somewhere around 400 rooms, that sort of thing. It's primarily a Pueblo III site, which means it was probably occupied primarily in the 1200s, and certainly appears to have been occupied right up until 1280 AD.
During the Pueblo III period, population was increasingly concentrated in the Four Corners region. 30,000 people lived in the area around Yellow Jacket, more than inhabit the area today. It was a time when many of the most spectacular ancestral Pueblo settlements were built. The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, others at Quetzal and Bitariquin, now part of Arizona's Navajo National Monument. Some experts suggest that these giant alcoves of sandstone were chosen as building sites because they were easily defensible. Pueblo prehistory appears to have been generally peaceful, with a high degree of cooperation among different groups. But by the 13th century, there is increasing evidence of conflict, sometimes even violent conflict, as growing populations competed for diminishing resources.
There may have been a lot of friction between the different groups as they competed for limited resources or different resources. There may have been a lot more disease and malnutrition as we got these larger villages. We see that in underdeveloped countries today, where we have a lot of disease and malnutrition in areas that are very heavily populated.
Tree ring dating indicates that between the years 1276 and 1299, a prolonged drought gripped the Southwest. For the ancestral Pueblo people, it was probably the last straw. They packed up and abandoned the Four Corners area completely for well-watered sites on the Hopi mesas and the Rio Grande Valley, where most of the pueblos of their descendants remain today. About the same time that the ancestral Pueblo people left the Four Corners for the Rio Grande, these homes, now part of New Mexico's Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, were also being vacated. They were built by another ancient southwestern culture we call Mogollon. The Mogollon people inhabited the high mountainous regions and river valleys of southern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona. Perhaps the most famous legacy of the Mogollon are these beautiful pots, created about 1100 AD by people who lived in what is now New Mexico's Mimbres River Valley. In the Mimbres Valley, and at some other Mogollon sites, masonry architecture, borrowed perhaps from the ancestral Puebloans to the north, met canal irrigation, the distinguishing trait of the Hohokam to the west. Like their neighbors, the Mogollon were also active traders, especially with the people who eventually built Casas Grandes, a vast metropolis located in what is now the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. Casas Grandes is a huge site, 27 times as large as Chaco Canyon's Pueblo Bonito. Some of the Mogollon may have moved there after abandoning the Mimbres and Gila River valleys about the year 1300. Others built pueblos farther west in the Arizona highlands. By 1400, they had left the mountains altogether, perhaps to join the Hopi and Zuni people to the north. Near the Gila River, within the city of Globe, Arizona, is the archaeological site of Beshbagoa. Beshbagoa is unusual among ancestral Southwest sites, for this ancient pueblo has not only been excavated, part of it has been restored to look the way it probably looked hundreds of years ago, when it was inhabited by people many archaeologists now call the Salado. Like the Mogollon, the Salado also lived in masonry homes and practiced canal irrigation. The Salado appear to have made a very successful adaptation to their environment. But they too left their homes, and we are not certain where they went. Just north of Flagstaff, Arizona, the snowy summits of the San Francisco Peaks preside over a rugged area of pine forest and high desert. Here, another southwestern culture, the Sinawa, flourished in the 12th century. In the fall of the year 1064, this mountain erupted violently, sending a rain of ash, rock, and molten lava over the surrounding countryside. The eruption of Sunset Crater buried the pit houses of the people who lived in the area and forced them to flee for their lives. Not long afterwards, they returned, having picked up some cultural traits from neighboring people. They built several masonry towns, like this one we now call Wupatki, on the harsh land below Sunset Crater, finding that volcanic ash which covered the ground retained moisture and made farming easier. At a first glance, Wupatki looks like a typical ancestral Pueblo site. But then, what is this? It's a ball court. 800 years ago, fierce games were played here. The ancestral Puebloans had no such games, but ball courts were common among the Hohokam to the south. Sinawans also built homes in the cliffs at a place we now call Walnut Canyon, just east of Flagstaff. They grew corn and other crops in the valley below. The Sinawa region was a melting pot of cultures and the center of an extensive trading network, which included the Puebloans, the Hohokam, and cultures far to the south in Mexico.
And there are a number of archaeologists who believe that the tradesmen came up from, actually physically traveled from Mesoamerica to the southwest. These are known as the Pushteca, and they're very similar to what I think of as a traveling salesman, where they carried a number of different artifacts with them and probably traded for other materials in return.
Eventually, the Sinawans moved south from the Flagstaff area into the lush valley of the Verde River. In the 13th century, they built homes in this natural spring, now called Montezuma Well. They also established the settlements now protected at Tuzigut National Monument and at Montezuma Castle. The Sinawa left the area in the 15th century, perhaps to join the Hopi Pueblos. Hohokam, Anasazi or Ancestral Pueblo, Mogollon, Salado, Sinawa. These are the ancient and sophisticated cultures built by those who came before, the prehistoric people of the Southwest.
What we do here in the conservation and preservation of these artifacts is as little as possible. We keep them in a climate.
At the Western Archaeological and Conservation Center, school children get a rare opportunity to see artifacts that are normally off limits to the public. These artifacts, and those which remain on or under the ground throughout the Southwest, may help answer the many questions which still persist about the ancient cultures of the region. In the early days, many artifacts were lost when ruins were robbed and desecrated by thieves of time.
Whole families used to go out on Sundays, for example, take a picnic, go out and dig an archaeological site for fun. And they would take the material home and put it on their mantle. Perhaps they would trade off with their friends, or they would sell it to the first archaeologist or to anybody else who was working the archaeological market.
Sites are still occasionally vandalized, and tourists often carry bits of pottery called sherds home with them.
If you take a potsherd from a site, it may be the one potsherd that helps date a site. If you take a projectile point or an arrowhead from a site, that is something also that helps to date a site or to tell who the trade partners were and what the people were doing, what they were hunting. So each one of these little parts is like a piece of the puzzle, and the more pieces the archaeology has to put together, the greater part of the story we can tell now.
Other sites are lost to new subdivisions as urban areas in the Southwest continue to expand rapidly.
And we're seeing now housing developments right backing up against the national park boundaries. And it's going to get to the point where we have development everywhere but the national parks. And you will see that the only archaeology which survives in a pristine condition is going to be in the national parks and state parks, other natural areas.
Jared. At New Mexico's Pecos National Monument, a National Park Service archaeology team conducts a site survey, the first step in the study of a prehistoric settlement. One member of the team makes an exciting discovery, a perfectly preserved pendant carved from a seashell. It's further evidence of prehistoric trade because Pecos is 700 miles from the nearest ocean. Pecos is a special place where evidence remains of a meeting between two cultures. Here, a 17th century Spanish church stands in the middle of a much older Indian pueblo that was once home to 2,000 people. It was here that Alfred Kidder developed a chronology of Southwest history extending back from the Spanish conquest to the origins of agriculture. Despite Kidder's work, much of Pecos still remains undisturbed. But these days, archaeologists uncover only small portions of sites to learn about the people who once lived there. Here, the Pecos survey team marks off a small section to collect pottery for further research. New methods of mapping allow them to pinpoint its location.
Over the last 100 years, archaeology has progressed enormously, both in terms of its techniques and its goals. We have much better ways of dating, much better ways of extracting information, so we can learn a lot more from a lot less.
For example, experts can now analyze the clays in these pottery sherds to find out where they came from, thus learning about the trading and travel patterns of the people.
We can dig a small amount, disturb and dig a small amount of a site, and probably learn more than 100 years ago they would have learned by digging the whole Pueblo.
Sampling helps us to preserve the rest of the site in a pristine condition so that as archaeology continues to further evolve, we'll have something for the future.
But in one respect, archaeologists have returned to methods employed more than a century ago. Like Adolph Bandelier, they are seeking the help of contemporary Native Americans to better understand the lifeways of their ancestors. At the same time, the tribes have shown increasing interest in the scientific study of their ancestors' lives. Many now run their own archaeological programs, like this one at the Gila River Indian community.
They slowly realize, I think, at least in my experience, that there's a rich culture out there, and it's right there below their feet. I mean, it's there, and it always will be there, and it's something they need to capture, because it's will not only benefit them as identity, but also benefit future generations.
The ancients live on in the American Southwest, in today's native cultures, and in the remarkable record they left behind. A legacy that must be passed on for all generations and all time.